In late 2025, a photo of Frank Zane began circulating online again. An 83-year-old man standing in a kitchen or a backyard, shirt off, abs visible, shoulders capped, arms still carrying shape. Most men lose by 50. Some assumed it was old footage. It wasn't. This is Frank Zane now, in his 80s, with a physique that hasn't followed the usual pattern of decline. The obvious explanation would be genetics, drugs, or luck, something that let one man avoid the deterioration everyone else experiences. That isn't what happened. The real explanation has less to do with his body than with a decision he made before he won a single trophy, one that almost no one else in his sport was making at the time. That decision is the reason he's still standing, still lean, and still capable, while most of the men he competed against are gone or in significantly worse physical condition. To understand Frank Zane at 83, it helps to go back to a version of him most people have never seen. A teenager in Kingston, Pennsylvania, reading a muscle magazine and deciding this was going to be his life. He wasn't a natural athlete. What he had was obsession and an almost academic curiosity about how the human body worked. By the time he was a teenager, he had added significant muscle through self-directed training without a coach or formula, relying instead on trial and error over several years. He won Mr. Pennsylvania at 19, an achievement that might have pushed him toward chasing size the way most young lifters did at the time. Bigger arms, a bigger chest, more weight on the bar, more food, more volume overall. He didn't follow that path. Instead, Zane went to college. He earned a degree, studied the body with the same seriousness most bodybuilders applied to training, and developed a mental framework that few of his rivals had. This is the origin of his nickname, the Chemist, not because he mixed anything in a lab, but because he approached his own physique as a long-term experiment, where every variable mattered and the goal was never simply maximum mass. The goal was balance and symmetry, a body that functioned as a system, not a collection of muscles stacked on top of each other. That distinction matters. It's the starting point for everything that follows, because while other bodybuilders in the late 60s and 70s treated their bodies as machines to be maximized, Zane treated his as something to be maintained. Maintenance turned out to be the strategy that lasted. In 1968, a young, powerfully built Austrian bodybuilder entered the Mr. Universe contest with a physique that appeared unbeatable. Size at that level typically didn't lose. Arnold Schwarzenegger was larger than nearly everyone on that stage, and by the standards most judges had used for years, larger was supposed to mean better. Frank Zane was not bigger. He was leaner, tighter, more proportioned. A smaller man playing a different game entirely. When the results came in, it was Zane's name that got called, not Arnold's. The loss reportedly stunned Arnold so badly that he couldn't quite process it. He had expected an easy win. Instead, the judges had rewarded conditioning and symmetry over raw size, and that result changed how bodybuilding was judged from that point forward. Arnold's response to the loss revealed as much about him as the result itself. He didn't dismiss it. He sought Zane out, asked him questions, and picked his brain about training and conditioning. The two became friends, and Arnold quietly rebuilt parts of his own approach around lessons from the man who had just beaten him. Size alone, Arnold realized, wasn't enough. A body needed control. It needed to look engineered, not just inflated. For Zane, the win was proof of concept. The approach he had been quietly building, discipline over brute force, precision over excess, could beat the biggest man in the sport. That confidence carried him through the next decade. The same philosophy that beat Arnold in 1968 is the one still keeping Zane's body intact today. A sustainable approach doesn't just win contests, it survives decades. By 1977, bodybuilding had entered an era where mass was king. Bigger competitors were dominating most divisions, and the sport's biggest stage, Mr. Olympia, was trending towards sheer size as the deciding factor. Frank Zane won it anyway. At roughly 200 pounds, a weight that would have been considered undersized by many of his rivals, he took the Olympia title in 1977, then again in 1978, and again in 1979, 3 consecutive wins, almost unheard of for a competitor that much lighter than the men around him. He did it by doubling down on exactly the thing that had beaten Arnold a decade earlier: precision, symmetry, and conditioning that made every inch of his physique look intentional. Where other competitors were adding raw size, Zane was sculpting what he already had into something that looked less like muscle and more like architecture. Building a body for maximum mass and building a body for maximum durability are not the same project. They often pull in opposite directions. Zane, even at the peak of his competitive career, was already leaning toward the version that lasts. He wasn't just trying to win the next Olympia. Without fully realizing it, he was laying the groundwork for what his body would look like decades later, long after most of his competitors had stopped training altogether. 3 consecutive Olympia titles positioned him as the favorite for a 4th, but bodybuilding rarely works that cleanly. The following year tested how durable his approach really was, not just to titles but to the body itself. Heading into 1980, Zane was the reigning 3-time Mr. Olympia, and based on how he had looked the previous year, many in the sport expected him to extend his reign even further. Then his body forced a different conversation. During his contest prep, Zane suffered a freak accident near a pool. slipping at the edge and sustaining an injury serious enough to require a hospital stay. The physical toll was significant. He lost a considerable amount of muscle mass during his recovery, at exactly the point in the calendar when he should have been adding final touches before the biggest stage of his career. Up to this point, Zane's career had been a string of validations, beating Arnold, winning 3 Olympias, proving his approach worked. The pool injury was the first real crack in that narrative. It showed in the most physical way possible that the body he'd spent 2 decades refining was not invincible. It could be taken from him in an instant, by something that had nothing to do with training or diet at all. What he did with that information mattered more than the injury itself. He didn't abandon his approach, and he didn't suddenly try to force his way back to peak condition through extreme measures. He worked with what his body could rebuild in the time available, and he still showed up. That instinct to adapt rather than force would echo through every decade that followed, all the way to the training he does today in his 80s. The body pushes back eventually. The only real choice is how a person responds when it does. Zane stepped onto the stage in 1980 still recovering, still short of his best condition, but ready to defend his title. Arnold Schwarzenegger retired for 5 years and deep into a film career announced his return to competition. The contest format had also shifted that year, dropping the weight class system that had given lighter competitors like Zane a fairer path to the overall title in previous years. When the results came in, Arnold won. Zane finished 3rd. The reaction from the bodybuilding world was immediate and loud. Other competitors were furious. Several judges' scorecards were publicly questioned, and Zane reportedly walked off stage and threw his trophy at a wall in frustration. It remains one of the most disputed outcomes in the sport's history, debated by fans and historians decades later. The fallout continued. Several competitors, Zane included, chose to boycott the following year's Olympia entirely, a direct protest against how the 1980 contest had played out. It was a costly stand to take, since boycotting the sport's biggest stage meant giving up a year of competition and exposure at the peak of his career. The decision showed something about Zane that the trophies alone could not. He wasn't chasing titles for their own sake. When the system stopped rewarding the thing he actually believed in, conditioning, fairness, substance over spectacle, he was willing to walk away from it rather than keep playing a game he no longer trusted. That is not the mindset of someone optimizing for one more win. It is the mindset of someone already, even then, thinking about the long arc of his career rather than any single moment in it. Zane returned to competition in 1982, taking 2nd place, proof that his body and his approach still had plenty left, even after everything that had happened 2 years earlier. It looked like he might be building toward one more run at the Olympia title in 1983. Then life intervened again. In the lead up to that contest, Zane was involved in a motorcycle crash, and the resulting injury disrupted his preparation. He competed anyway, finishing 4th. It would be his final professional contest. Most competitors in this sport don't get to choose how their competitive career ends. Age, injury, or fading relevance usually makes that decision for them, often messily, often years after they should have stepped away. Zane's ending wasn't perfectly clean either. A motorcycle crash isn't a storybook exit, but what came after it was his choice. He didn't force a comeback, and he didn't chase one more shot at glory past the point where it made sense for his body. He stepped off the competitive stage and into the next chapter on his own terms. That decision can be easy to overlook in a list of titles and rivalries, but it may be the most important one in this story. Athletes who keep competing long after their bodies have signaled it's time to stop are rarely the ones still in good shape decades later. Zane stopped while there was still something left to protect, and that choice gave him years that most retired athletes don't get back. Retirement from competition didn't mean retirement from the work. In the years that followed, Zane and his wife Christine opened Zane Haven in Palm Springs, California, where they worked directly with clients pursuing the same kind of balanced, symmetrical physique he had spent his career building. He shifted from competitor to teacher, from chasing his own results to helping others understand the principles that had carried him through 2 decades at the top. Though, this is where the nickname the Chemist earns its full meaning. Zane didn't freeze his training in 1983 and rely on the same methods for the rest of his life. He kept adjusting his approach, decade after decade, the same way he had since he was a teenager experimenting in his backyard. As his body aged, his methods aged with it. Less emphasis on heavy free weights, more reliance on machines that protected aging joints. He incorporated yoga, stretching, and breathwork, treating mobility and recovery with the same seriousness he had once reserved for building mass. Though, this wasn't the result of someone telling him aging required a different approach. It was a continuation of the same process he had always followed, paying close attention to what his body needed and adjusting accordingly, without forcing the methods of his 20s onto the body he had in his 60s and 70s. Most people train the same way until their body can no longer keep up. Zane treated his training as a system that was meant to change over time. That habit, repeated across more than 40 years, underlies the physique he has today. Though this returns to the question of how an 83-year-old man has maintained a physique at that age. It was not one secret, one supplement, or one piece of genetic luck. It was a series of decisions, each one building on the last, stretching back more than 60 years. It began with a teenager who studied his body rather than simply pushing through training. It continued through an upset win over a much larger competitor, a run of Olympia titles won without chasing mass for its own sake, and an injury that showed him his body had limits worth respecting. It held through a title he lost on a technicality and chose not to pursue through compromise, and a retirement he chose on his own terms rather than having it forced on him. And it continued through a training approach that kept evolving. At 83, Zane isn't training the way he did at 25, and that is the point. He is training as someone who has spent 6 decades learning what his body needs at each stage of life, and who has adjusted his methods accordingly. His physique today isn't a single moment, it is the result of an approach that never stopped changing. Most competitors in this sport built bodies meant to peak for a single afternoon under bright lights. Frank Zane built one meant to last a lifetime. At 83, still lean and still capable, he reflects the outcome of that approach.